The Queen in chains. The wind howled across the northern sea, dragging the sound of distant thunder across the gray horizon, the kind of sound that made every living thing feel smaller than the ocean itself. And on that storm-torn morning, the ships of the Northmen appeared like ghosts rising from the mist. Their dragon heads cut through the waves with hunger in their eyes, carrying men whose lives were built on the edge of the sword and the mercy of storms. They came not just for gold or land, but for legacy, for stories that would echo after death. When they reached the coast of Ironfell, a peaceful island kingdom ruled by a just but aging king, their oars struck the water like war drums. The kingdom had no warning, no time to prepare, and within hours, the silence of dawn turned into the roar of fire and steel. The people of Ironfell ran for safety, the bells of the great temple rang, and smoke rose like a second dawn over the sea. Inside the royal hall, Queen Sigruna clutched her swollen belly as the walls shook. She was 8 months pregnant, carrying the last hope of her bloodline. Her husband, King Aldrich, had fallen in the first charge, and now she stood alone, surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting, the sound of screams echoing through the corridors. She had been known in her youth as the queen with the voice of peace, the one who had ended wars through words, but that day there were no words left that could save her people. When the doors burst open and the Vikings stormed in, her crown was torn from her head, her gold trampled under muddy boots, and the very hall where she had sung songs of spring became a prison filled with the smell of death. She did not cry. She stood tall, even as her guards were cut down before her. Her silence became a shield, her stillness a rebellion that none of the invaders could understand. The warlord leading the raid was named Bjorn Ironside, a man whose name carried both pride and curse. He had conquered many kingdoms, but none with a queen like Sigruna. When his men found her standing in her tattered gown, blood on her hands from tending to the dying, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hesitation. She was no ordinary captive. Her eyes carried the kind of defiance that burns quietly, but never fades. "You are queen no more," he said in his deep, rough voice, "but you are worth more than gold." His men jeered, thinking she would beg or curse him, but she only looked at him and said in a steady voice, "Gold melts, iron rusts, but shame lasts forever." Her words cut deeper than a sword. Bjorn did not strike her. Instead, he ordered that she be taken alive to his ship. As they dragged her away, she looked back at the burning hall, her people, her home, her king, all gone. But the fire that consumed her kingdom lit another one in her heart, a quiet, enduring flame of survival. Days passed as the longships cut across the endless sea. Sigruna sat chained near the mast, the salt air drying her tears, her hands resting on the life growing inside her. Around her were slaves and warriors drunk on their victories, singing songs to the gods. At night, when the stars burned cold above the black waters, she whispered to her unborn child stories of their home, of the lilac trees near the temple, of the laughter of her people, of the promise that one day, even if she was gone, her child would carry their name beyond fear. The sailors mocked her for speaking to her belly, calling her the Mad Queen, but she ignored them. To her, speaking was strength, and silence was death. Each night she prayed not for freedom, but for endurance, for the strength to bring her child into a world that had forgotten mercy. When the ships finally reached the northern coast of Skelderheim, Bjorn's homeland, winter was already clawing at the earth. His people cheered at his return, for he brought back treasures, slaves, and stories of conquest. Yet none drew as much attention as the queen he had captured. The village whispered of her beauty, her courage, her fire. Some called her a witch, others a saint, for she neither wept nor screamed. She simply watched everything with calm, steady eyes. Bjorn gave her a place in his great hall, not as an equal, but as a symbol of his triumph. "The Queen of Ironfell will sit beside my throne," he declared, as proof that even kings bow to the north. His warriors roared with laughter, but Sigruna's silence cut through the noise like a blade. Every woman in that hall saw something they couldn't name, the look of a soul that refused to be broken. Weeks turned into months, and in the depth of the northern winter, Sigruna gave birth. The midwives expected her to scream, but she did not. She bit her lip until blood ran down her chin, holding her newborn close the moment he entered the world. She named him Arik, a name that meant eternal ruler in her tongue. Bjorn looked at the child and saw both curse and prophecy. He had thought to use her to breed power, to claim her child as his own, and unite two bloodlines under fear. But when he looked at her cradling that infant with eyes filled with both love and defiance, he felt a strange unease. In that moment, he saw something stronger than his armies, the quiet power of a mother's will. "This child is born of war," he said. "He will grow under my rule." But Sigruna looked up and whispered, "No, he will grow beyond it." That sentence marked the beginning of a storm greater than any he had sailed through. Life in captivity was harsh, but Sigruna adapted. She learned the Norse tongue, walked among the people, and watched everything. The women of the north began to respect her, not because she was a queen, but because she worked, she listened, and she helped the sick and the old without pride. Her calm presence softened hearts that once saw her as a prize. Even Bjorn's sister Astrid grew close to her, often saying, "You are not of our blood, but the gods have surely sent you for a reason." The child, Arik, grew strong and clever. With his mother's eyes and his father's temper, he learned to walk early, to fight early, and to question everything. Sigruna raised him to know both compassion and strength. She never told him of his true father, not yet. "The world will tell you stories of kings and conquerors," she said once, holding him near the fire. "But remember, my son, it is not crowns that make a man, it is the heart that refuses to bow." As years passed, rumors began to stir. Some said Sigruna's presence had softened Bjorn's heart. Others said she bewitched him. But the truth was simpler. She reminded him of what he had lost. In his youth, he had believed glory was born only in conquest, but watching her, he began to see another kind of power, the kind that did not need swords to command respect. One night, as they sat by the fire, he asked her, "Do you hate me?" She looked into the flames and said softly, "I hate what you became." Those words stayed with him long after she left the room. The next day, he ordered that her chains be removed. "A queen does not wear iron," he said to his men, though he did not yet understand why he said it. But peace, even false peace, cannot last in a world built on blood. A rival chieftain named Ulfar saw Bjorn's mercy as weakness. He began to whisper among the warriors that the warlord had been tamed by a southern witch. One night, during a great feast, Ulfar stood before the crowd and challenged Bjorn openly. "The gods do not favor men who let their enemies live," he shouted, "and they will curse a house ruled by a queen's ghost." The hall grew silent. Bjorn rose slowly, his eyes hard. "You think me weak?" he said. "Then test your strength." They fought under the torches, and when it ended, Ulfar lay dead, his blood staining the stone floor. But his words did not die. They spread through the land like wind through dry grass, and before long the people began to question whether the gods truly smiled on Bjorn's hall. Storms came, crops failed, and famine crept through the villages. The seers whispered that the gods were angry, that no northern king should ever keep a foreign queen under his roof. When the whispers reached her, Sigruna stood in the temple before the idol of Odin and prayed. "If my presence brings suffering," she whispered, "then let it fall on me, not on the innocent." That night, she dreamed of a raven carrying her son away over mountains and seas. She awoke with tears on her face and a strange calm in her heart. She knew her story was not over. It was only changing shape. The next morning, she found Bjorn standing outside the hall, staring at the gray horizon. He looked older, broken by doubts he could not voice. When he turned to her, his eyes softened. "You will never be my captive again," he said quietly. "But you will never be free of what we began." She nodded, understanding more than he knew. For in that moment, Sigruna realized that survival was not about escape. It was about outlasting those who believed they owned your fate. The blood of two worlds, the snows of Skeldurheim melted slowly that spring, revealing fields that had slept too long under frost and silence, and among them the small figure of a boy chasing the wind with bare feet and a wooden sword in his hand. Arik, the child born of war, had grown into a boy of fierce eyes and restless spirit. He carried the quiet pride of his mother and the fire of his father, though neither world fully claimed him. The villagers called him the half-born, a child not of the north nor the south, but something in between. Yet even in his youth, there was something in his stride that silenced mockery. He walked like a prince, though he wore no crown, and when he spoke, even the elders paused to listen. His mother, Queen Sigruna, watched from the doorway of the longhouse as the boy swung his sword at invisible enemies. There were moments when he looked so much like King Aldrich that her heart ached, yet she also saw in him something entirely new, something that did not belong to kings or conquerors, but to the future itself. Bjorn Ironside, the warlord who had once brought ruin upon her world, had grown quieter with the years. His hair had turned gray, his once fierce temper dulled into something almost human. The fire that had built his legend was now a memory, and though his hall still echoed with songs of battle, there were fewer ships leaving his shores each spring. He had begun to spend long nights staring into the fire, drinking little, saying less. Sometimes he would call for Sigruna, not to command her but to listen. They spoke of gods, of storms, of guilt. He confessed that the faces of the dead came to him in dreams, whispering of debts unpaid. And she, who had once prayed for his death, began to see the weight that time had carved into him. "The gods you worship," she told him one night, "are not cruel because they are strong. They are cruel because they are lonely." He said nothing, but the words stayed with him long after she left the room. That night, for the first time in decades, Bjorn Ironside dreamed not of war, but of peace. But peace was not the fate of their house. Far to the south, whispers had begun to rise once more from the shattered lands of Ironfell. The survivors of the Old Kingdom had gathered around a banner of memory, the symbol of the silver falcon that had once flown above Sigruna's palace. Traders brought tales north of a young chieftain who claimed descent from the fallen king and vowed vengeance upon the Norse. They said he was building ships, gathering warriors, preparing to strike at the very heart of Skeldrheim. When Bjorn's scouts brought this news, the old warlord's face hardened, the fire rekindling in his eyes. "The past has a long shadow," he said, "and it never forgets." Sigruna heard the same words and felt a chill run through her. She knew that this war, if it came, would not be fought between kings and raiders. It would be fought between the ghosts of what they had lost. That night she went to her son's bedside. Arik slept soundly, his hand curled around a small wooden carving of a falcon, one of the few relics she had saved from their homeland. She brushed his hair back and whispered, "My son, there are storms coming, storms that care little for who is right or wrong. But you must never let hatred guide you. Let memory be your sword and mercy your shield." The boy stirred but did not wake, and she sat beside him until the candle burned low, her heart torn between the love of the man who had destroyed her world and the duty to the child who would one day rebuild it. In the following weeks, the tension in Bjorn's hall grew heavy. Messengers rode in with word of raiders sighted on the southern coasts, banners marked with the silver falcon. The same emblem that had once flown above Sigruna's throne now flew over ships of vengeance. The irony was not lost on her. Bjorn called his council, and though many urged immediate war, he hesitated. "These men," he said slowly, "fight for the dead. There is no victory in such a war." But others in the hall were not so wise. Young warriors, eager for glory, whispered that the gods would abandon a chief who refused battle. Among them was Hroth, Bjorn's nephew, a man with ambition in his blood and envy in his heart. He had always resented Arik, the child who drew his uncle's favor. "A foreign woman has cursed this hall," he spat one night after too much ale. "She has bewitched the chief and poisoned his line. Her son will bring ruin to us all." His words spread like fire in dry grass. One evening, as dusk bled across the horizon, Hroth gathered his men and approached Sigruna's dwelling. She stood outside with Arik, teaching him how to read the runes carved on old stones when they surrounded her. "The time has come," Hroth sneered, "to rid this land of the witch and her bastard." Sigruna did not flinch. She looked at him with eyes as cold as the sea. "If I am a witch," she said, "then you should pray I never curse you." Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled. Before they could strike, Bjorn appeared, his sword in hand, his voice thunderous with rage. "Touch her," he roared, "and I will tear your heart from your chest." The man hesitated, caught between fear and pride. For a long moment the night held its breath. Then Hroth spat on the ground and turned away, muttering, "You will regret this, old man. The gods do not bless traitors." That night he fled north with his followers, and by morning the first signs of rebellion were already spreading through the valleys. War came sooner than anyone expected. The men loyal to Hroth struck first, burning villages loyal to Bjorn, claiming that the gods demanded sacrifice for the queen's sin. Then, as if fate itself had conspired, the ships from the south appeared on the horizon. Ironfell's vengeance returned. Two armies, one born of betrayal and the other of memory, now converged upon Bjorn's hall. The old warlord, his hair white as bone, stood once more in his armor, though his hands trembled as he fastened the straps. Sigruna watched him from across the room, knowing that this would be his final battle. "I took everything from you," he said softly, not looking up. "And still you stayed." She shook her head. "No, Bjorn, I endured. That is not the same as staying." He smiled faintly, the ghost of a warrior who had finally understood. "Then endure a little longer," he said, "for your son will need a mother when the world forgets his father." The battle that followed was not like the songs. It was not glory and horns and shining swords. It was mud and fire and screams that tore the sky. The traitors clashed with the Southerners, both believing they fought for justice, and in the middle stood Bjorn's men, torn by loyalty. Sigruna stayed within the hall with Arik, listening as the sound of death drew closer. When the doors finally burst open and Hroth stormed in, his face smeared with blood, she shielded her son behind her. "The witch will die!" he snarled, raising his axe. But before he could strike, a shadow fell across the room. Bjorn staggered through the doorway, wounded and pale, yet his eyes burned with the last fire of his youth. "Not today," he growled. The axe swung, steel met steel, and for a moment the hall was filled with the clash of destiny. When it ended, Hroth lay dead, and Bjorn fell to his knees beside him, blood pouring from his wounds. Sigruna knelt beside the dying warlord, holding his head in her lap as he gasped for breath. Outside, the noise of battle faded into silence. "Tell him," Bjorn whispered, looking at the boy who stood trembling nearby. "Tell him. He was born not from conquest, but from courage." Then his eyes grew distant, and with one final breath, Bjorn Ironside, the terror of the seas, was gone. For a long time, Sigruna did not move. She sat in the blood-soaked hall, holding the man who had destroyed her world and, in his final act, saved it. When she finally rose, her face was calm, her eyes dry. She turned to her son and said, "Arik, remember this night. The gods do not choose who lives or dies. They only watch what we do with the time they give us." In the days that followed, the armies melted away, the rebellion died with its leaders, and the snows returned to cover the dead. Sigruna burned the hall herself, standing in the ashes as the smoke rose toward the sky. She took her son's hand and began the long journey south, back to the land of her birth, though she knew there would be no kingdom waiting for her. What awaited was exile, but also freedom. As they walked through the endless white fields, Arik looked up and asked, "Mother, are we still royal?" She smiled faintly, brushing the snow from his hair. "Royalty is not in blood," she said. "It is in how we rise when the world falls." And with that, they disappeared into the horizon. Mother and son, two souls carrying the memory of both mercy and war. The kingdom without a throne. The path that led away from Skelderheim was not one of victory but of endurance, winding through forests where snow fell even in spring, and across valleys where silence weighed heavier than the sky. Sigruna walked with her son, Arik, through those lands with nothing but a cloak of wolf fur, a small satchel of bread, and a heart that refused to break. They were no longer prisoners, yet freedom had no meaning when one had nowhere left to return. The great kingdom of Ironfell lay far to the south, its throne long taken by men who had forgotten her name. But Sigruna's steps did not falter, for she was no longer walking toward a crown, she was walking toward redemption. Each dawn she would whisper a prayer, not to the gods who had remained silent during her suffering, but to the wind itself, as if the spirit of her fallen husband and the soul of Bjorn Ironside still lingered in the breath of the earth. The journey was cruel. They crossed frozen rivers that cracked beneath their feet, mountains where hunger gnawed at them like a beast, and villages where people looked away, afraid to help strangers who carried the mark of war. Yet through all this, Arik never once complained. The boy, not yet a man, had inherited his mother's quiet strength. When the nights grew cold, he would gather firewood without being asked. When bandits tried to steal from them, he stood in front of his mother, wooden staff in hand, eyes filled with fury. He had seen death, betrayal, and exile before his 13th winter, but he had also seen mercy and courage. Sigruna often watched him as he slept, the flicker of the fire dancing across his face, and thought that perhaps the gods, in their strange cruelty, had given her one last gift, a child who could rebuild what they had destroyed. By the time they reached the southern borders of Ironfell, spring had turned the forests into a sea of green. The air was warmer, the rivers alive with sound. But the kingdom she once knew had changed beyond recognition. The villages bore new flags, the old temples were in ruins, and even the language on people's tongues had shifted. The new rulers were men from the Eastern Isles, warlords who had seized power after decades of chaos. They called themselves protectors of the realm, but the people whispered that they ruled through fear, not honor. When Sigruna walked through the marketplace of Roarhaven, the new capital, no one recognized her. To them she was just another weary traveler, another widow from a forgotten war. That anonymity was both blessing and curse. She wanted her people to live in peace, yet seeing her homeland enslaved by strangers filled her with a rage so deep it tasted like iron in her mouth. Arik, however, saw opportunity where his mother saw ruin. "If they do not know us," he said, "then we can build anew." His words startled her, for they sounded older than his years. He had begun working as a stable hand for a merchant who pitied their poverty. Day after day he listened, learned, and observed. He heard how the warlords taxed the poor until their backs broke, how the nobles whispered of rebellion but lacked a leader to unite them. He began to understand that kingdoms were not built by birthright, but by belief. "A crown," he told his mother one night as they sat by the fire outside the city walls, "is only as strong as the people who believe in it. If I can make them believe in me, I do not need a throne to rule." Sigruna looked at him for a long time, her eyes filled with both pride and fear. "Belief can build," she said softly, "but it can also destroy. Do not let power become your faith." He smiled faintly. "I will not, mother. I only want to give them hope." And so began the quiet rise of the boy who had no name. In the villages, whispers spread of a young man who helped the weak, who taught the children to read, who stopped soldiers from beating farmers. He carried no banner, yet people began to follow him. The peasants called him the Falcon's son, though few knew the truth of his blood. He spoke with a voice calm and certain, a voice that made men remember their dignity. Sigruna watched him gather the forgotten, the broken, and the weary, weaving them into something stronger than an army, a family bound by purpose. She helped heal the wounded, taught mothers how to grow herbs again, and rebuilt the small shrines to the old gods. Not as idols of war, but as symbols of resilience. It was not a rebellion yet. It was a rebirth. But hope once born cannot hide forever. The warlords began to hear of this boy and his followers. At first they laughed, dismissing him as a dreamer. But when caravans began to refuse their taxes, when villages refused their orders, laughter turned to anger. One of them, a cruel man named Varric the Red, decided to make an example. He sent 50 soldiers to burn the village where Arik lived. They came at dawn, swords drawn, setting fire to the thatched roofs and cutting down anyone who resisted. Sigruna was fetching water from the stream when she saw the smoke rising, and she ran, her heart tearing with every step. She found her son at the center of the chaos, standing before the villagers with nothing but a spear in his hand. The soldiers charged, but Arik moved like a shadow of the wind. He fought not with rage, but with precision, disarming his enemies rather than killing them. Even when he was struck, he did not falter. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, the soldiers had fled, leaving their dead behind. The villagers gathered around him, and one old man fell to his knees, shouting, "The Falcon has returned!" From that day forward, the legend began. That night, as they buried the dead, Sigruna sat beside her son. His arm was cut, his face bruised, but his eyes burned with purpose. "You have started something you cannot stop," she said quietly. He nodded. "Then I will finish it." She shook her head. "Revenge is easy. Restoration is harder. If you build your kingdom on blood, it will drown in it." He looked at her with a sadness that pierced her heart. "I am not building a kingdom of blood," he said. "I am building one of memory." She said nothing more, for she saw that his mind was already walking paths she could not follow. In the months that followed, Arik's name spread beyond the valleys. Merchants spoke of a young leader who brought justice where the crown brought cruelty. Former soldiers began to join his cause, men tired of serving tyrants. Villages flew banners painted with the silver falcon, not as a symbol of war but of freedom. The boy born of a queen and a conqueror had become the voice of two worlds. He spoke with the compassion of the South and the strength of the North. And yet, despite the growing hope around him, Sigruna's heart grew heavy. She had seen this story before. She had lived it. Power, even in the hands of the righteous, was a flame that could consume everything it touched. One evening, as the wind carried the scent of rain, she called her son to her tent. "Arik," she said softly, "promise me one thing." He looked at her, puzzled. "What is it?" She took his hand, her voice trembling. "When you stand before your enemies, remember that you are not just my son. You are the son of two worlds, one that knew mercy and one that knew conquest. Do not let either one blind you." He nodded, though she could see he did not fully understand. "I promise, Mother," he said. But promises made in youth are fragile things, easily broken by the weight of destiny. As summer turned to autumn, war came once more to Ironfell, not of invasion this time, but of awakening. The falcon's banners flew across the countryside, the people rose against their oppressors, and for the first time in decades, the sound of battle was mixed with the cry of freedom. Yet for every village liberated, another was burned. For every tyrant slain, another rose. And amid the growing storm, Sigruna saw the truth. The cycle she had fought all her life was repeating, only with new faces, new names, and the same old wounds. She began to fear not the enemies at their gates, but the fire within her son. On the eve of the great battle for Roarhaven, the city where her crown once gleamed, she sat alone in her tent, listening to the distant drums. The air smelled of smoke and rain. She knew what was coming. Her son would march into history, and history would demand its price. She closed her eyes and whispered into the night, "May the gods, for once, show mercy to those who carry no sword." The price of fire. The dawn before battle carried a silence heavier than death. The air itself felt as if it were waiting to breathe, and the sky above Roarhaven was gray, neither night nor day, as though the heavens themselves refused to choose a side. Arik stood on the hill overlooking the city that had once been his mother's home, now the stronghold of tyrants and fear. From this height, the towers looked almost beautiful, washed in the pale light of morning. But he knew what hid beneath them: chains, hunger, and the cries of those who had forgotten the sound of freedom. Around him, his men prepared for war, their faces hardened not by greed but by memory. They were farmers, smiths, hunters, men and women who had lost everything but their will. They called him King of the Falcon, though he had never crowned himself. To them, he was the spark that had turned years of silence into flame. Yet as he watched the smoke rise from the city gates, Arik felt no triumph. He felt the weight of a promise he had made long ago, to build, not destroy, and wondered whether he could keep it when the world demanded blood. Inside the command tent, Sigruna sat in quiet thought. She had aged beyond her years, her once golden hair now streaked with silver, her hands marked by labor and time. But her eyes, sharp and unwavering, were still the same. Eyes that had seen kingdoms rise and fall, men turn to monsters, and monsters learn to weep. When Arik entered, she looked up and smiled faintly. "So," she said softly, "the boy who dreamed of peace has brought an army to the gates." He knelt beside her, taking her hand. "I never wanted war," he said. "But peace cannot grow in soil poisoned by fear." She studied him for a long moment before replying, "Then be careful, my son. Even good men can become the very fear they seek to destroy." He bowed his head, understanding her meaning but unable to turn back. The wheel of fate was already turning, and he was caught in its spokes. The first horn of battle sounded as the sun broke through the clouds. Thousands moved as one, shields locking, spears glinting. The warlords of the East had fortified Roarhaven well, but they did not understand the heart of a people fighting not for conquest, but for memory. Arik led from the front, his banner of the silver, falcon soaring high above the chaos. He fought like the sea itself, relentless, rising and falling with each wave of men that came against him. His soldiers shouted his name, not as a king's, but as a brother's. Behind them, Sigruna moved among the wounded, her hands stained with blood, her voice steady as she whispered prayers over the dying. She could not bear to watch her son fight, but she could not turn away either. Each scream carried her back to that day long ago when the Vikings had stormed her hall, and she had stood alone. Now it was her child who stood before fire and steel, and she knew the gods had a cruel sense of symmetry. By noon, the outer gates had fallen. The rebels poured into the city, driving back the guards who had ruled through terror. The people began to open their doors, to throw stones and boiling oil from rooftops, to rise with the same fire that once burned in their ancestors. It should have been victory, but victory, like war, has many faces. As the rebels pushed deeper into the city, the order began to break. Looting spread, torches were thrown, and the streets that had been paved with oppression now burned with vengeance. Arik tried to stop it, shouting for restraint, but the tide was too strong. These were not soldiers, they were people who had been broken too long. Their justice came with flames, and in their eyes every noble, every guard, every servant of the crown was guilty. When Arik saw an old magistrate dragged from his home, begging for mercy, only to be struck down by men wearing his own emblem, he felt something inside him crack. "Stop!" he roared, but his voice was drowned in the sound of fire. That night, Roarhaven was a city of ash. The palace at its heart, where his mother had once walked in gold halls, was now a ruin of smoke and shattered marble. Arik stood in the great courtyard, staring at the fallen statue of the last Eastern king, its stone face split in two. Around him, the rebels celebrated, drunk on freedom and wine, chanting his name again and again. "Arik the Liberator! The Falcon King!" But he felt no joy. He saw only ghosts, the faces of those he could not save, the innocents burned in the crossfire, the city that had traded one set of flames for another. Sigruna approached him quietly, her cloak pulled against the cold night wind. "It is done," she said. He shook his head. "No, mother. It has only begun." His voice trembled, and when she looked closer, she saw tears glistening in his eyes. "I wanted to build a home," he whispered, "but I have built a pyre." In the days that followed, the new kingdom began to take shape. The surviving nobles swore fealty, the soldiers bent the knee, and the people crowned Arik not with gold, but with a circlet of iron forged from the chains once used by their oppressors. It was meant as a symbol of humility, but Sigruna saw the danger in it. A crown, even of iron, still carried the same weight. He built schools where barracks had stood, granaries where prisons had been, and temples dedicated not to gods of war but to peace. The people adored him, called him the just king, the bringer of dawn. Yet in every council meeting, every decision of justice, she could see the fire growing behind his calm. He spoke with reason, but his eyes had begun to carry the same storm she had once seen in Bjorn Ironside. Power was no longer his goal, but it was beginning to live within him, whispering softly of destiny and necessity. Then came the betrayal, not from enemies, but from within. One of Arik's closest captains, a man named Fenric, had grown disillusioned with his restraint. "We won this land by the sword," he said one night in the council hall, "and we will lose it if we do not rule it the same way." Arik disagreed. "If we rebuild with the same cruelty, then nothing has changed." But Fenric would not listen. He gathered soldiers still hungry for blood and gold, men who had fought for freedom but found peace too quiet. One evening they struck. They seized the granaries, slaughtered the council guards, and declared that the Falcon throne should be ruled by strength, not mercy. The city that had barely healed began to bleed again. Fires rose from the streets, cries echoed through the night, and Sigruna once more found herself in a world where the scent of smoke was indistinguishable from that of sorrow. Arik rode through the chaos, his face dark with grief. He had tried to lead through justice, but now justice demanded steel. When he confronted Fenric in the old palace courtyard, the man laughed. "You have your mother's heart," he said. "It will be your undoing." Arik drew his sword, his voice cold as winter. "Then let mercy undo me." Their blades clashed beneath the burning sky, sparks flying as if the gods themselves watched from above. The battle was short and brutal. When it ended, Fenric lay dead, and Arik stood covered in ash and blood, staring at the weapon in his hands. The people would later call it victory. To him, it was loss. After the rebellion was crushed, the kingdom fell into uneasy peace. But within that peace lived a growing emptiness. Arik rarely smiled anymore, rarely spoke of dreams. He ruled wisely, but with a distance that chilled those closest to him. Sigruna often found him standing at the old city walls, gazing north toward the land where his father had once ruled. You look to the sea too often, she told him once. What do you see there? He answered without turning. The ghosts of what I might become. She placed her hand on his shoulder. You are not your father. He shook his head slowly. No, but I understand him now. That night, as the wind swept through the halls of their rebuilt palace, Sigruna dreamed once more of the raven, the same vision that had haunted her years ago in the north. But this time the raven did not carry her son away. It circled above him, its wings black as smoke, its eyes like burning coals. She awoke with tears on her face, whispering to the dark, the fire that warms can also consume. She knew then what fate awaited every ruler born of both mercy and war. The world would love him until it feared him, and when it feared him, it would destroy him. Yet she also knew something the gods did not. Love endures longer than empires. And even kings born of fire can learn to walk through the ashes without losing their soul. And as the dawn broke again over Roarhaven, the city that had risen from ruin, Sigruna stood on the balcony watching her son greet his people. They cheered, their voices rising like thunder, believing their future had finally begun. She smiled faintly, though her eyes were filled with both pride and sorrow. For she knew that the story of the Falcon King was far from over. The greatest battles were no longer against enemies of flesh and blood, but against the ghosts of his own heart. The return of the North, the years rolled over Roarhaven like waves against a silent shore, and though the scars of war had faded from its stones, they remained etched in the hearts of its people. Under King Aric's rule, the land of Ironfell had begun to bloom again. Markets thrived, the old temples were rebuilt, and fields that had once been soaked in blood now swayed with golden harvests. Songs of freedom echoed in the streets, and the silver falcon flew proudly above every gate. Yet peace, no matter how lovingly built, is fragile when born from conquest. Beyond the northern mountains, where snow never melted and wolves howled across endless tundra, the clans of Skelderheim stirred once more. For to the sons of the north, Aric was not a savior or a just king. He was the blood of a traitor, the son of Bjorn Ironside's foreign queen, the child of shame. In their sagas, his name was spoken with venom, and their new warlord, a ruthless chieftain named Rorik the Black, vowed to reclaim the honor they believed stolen from them. The north would rise again, and this time its vengeance would burn like frostbite, slow, cold, and unrelenting. Sigruna sensed the storm long before the scouts brought word of it. Age had taken its toll on her body, yet her instincts remained sharp as ever. She had known the ways of kings and warriors, the rhythm of fate that repeated through generations. The night before the message arrived, she sat by the fire, watching the flame twist and whisper as if speaking in the old tongue of gods. Aric entered quietly, dressed in a simple cloak, his crown left behind on the table. He had begun to wear it less and less, claiming that peace needed no symbols. But Sigruna saw the truth. It was because it weighed heavier than iron ever could. "The north is restless," she said without looking up. "I can feel their breath on the wind." He stopped behind her, silent for a long moment, then answered, "I have already received word. Rorik marches with 10,000 men. They burn every village that bears our sigil." She closed her eyes briefly. Then the cycle begins again. He crouched beside her, taking her hand. "I will not let them destroy what we've built." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "You cannot fight ghosts, my son. You can only end the story that gives them life." When the council gathered the next morning, fear crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. The ministers urged Aric to fortify the capital, to call for alliances, to strike first and burn the passes that led through the northern mountains. But he refused. "If we become what they are," he said firmly, "then we have already lost." His generals exchanged uneasy glances, whispering that mercy had made their king blind. Sigruna listened in silence from the edge of the hall, watching her son stand before men twice his age, his voice steady but his eyes weary. When the council ended, she followed him to the balcony overlooking the city. "You speak like a man who carries the weight of the world," she said softly. He turned to her, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Perhaps I do. You once told me that royalty is not in blood, but in how we rise when the world falls. I am only trying to rise." She touched his face gently, feeling the man her child had become. "Then rise, my son. But remember, those who rise too high often forget the earth beneath them." Within weeks, the first battles began. The northern raiders struck like ghosts, swift and brutal, vanishing into the snow before reinforcements could arrive. Villages along the border burned, their survivors fleeing south with tales of horror, entire families buried in ice, warriors crucified on pines, the mark of the wolf carved into their flesh. Rorik the Black was not a man of armies, but of fear, and his message was clear. He had come not merely to conquer, but to erase. Arik rode north to confront him, leaving Sigruna behind in Roarhaven under the care of her attendants. Yet every night she stood at her window, gazing toward the mountains, praying to the gods she no longer trusted. "Do not test him as you tested me," she whispered into the cold air. "Let him learn that victory is not bought with cruelty." The campaign dragged through winter. Arik's men suffered in the cold, their fires dying faster than their courage. Rorik knew the terrain as if the land itself fought beside him. He struck at supply lines, ambushed small camps, and spread rumors that the Falcon King had fallen. In time, morale began to wither. One moonless night, as snow fell in endless sheets, Rorik's forces surrounded Arik's army in a narrow pass. The wind howled, the torches sputtered, and for a moment it seemed as though the gods had returned to watch the end of the bloodline they themselves had cursed. Arik stood at the front of his camp, sword drawn, the silver falcon gleaming faintly in the firelight. He did not flinch. "You came for my father's sins," he shouted into the blizzard, "but you will die for your own." Then, with a cry that split the storm, he led the charge. The battle lasted until dawn. The snow turned crimson beneath the feet of men who could no longer feel the earth. Arik fought as if possessed by the spirits of both his lineages, the relentless fury of the north and the unbreakable resolve of the south. By morning, the pass was littered with bodies, and Rorik the Black lay dying beneath a shattered banner. Arik knelt beside him, breathing hard. "You fight well," he said quietly. Rorik spat blood into the snow. "You think yourself a king of peace, but your hands are as red as mine." Arik hesitated, his sword hovering above the fallen chieftain. Then instead of striking, he lowered it. "The difference," he whispered, "is that I remember what it cost." He rose, leaving Rorik to the mercy of the wind. His men wanted victory songs, but Arik forbade them. "There is no glory in surviving war," he told them. "Only duty." When he returned to Roarhaven, months later, he was greeted as a hero. The people filled the streets, throwing flowers, singing hymns, praising his name. Yet he walked among them like a shadow, his expression unreadable. In the great hall, Sigruna waited, her cane trembling in her grip. When she saw him, she smiled, a small, fragile smile that carried a lifetime of battles and prayers. "You came back," she whispered. He took her hands gently, his voice raw. "The war is over." But she looked into his eyes and saw what others could not, the storm that had not yet passed. "No," she said softly. "It has only changed its name." That evening, they sat by the fire for the first time in years, without speaking of politics, armies, or kingdoms. Arik told her of the snow, the screams, the faces he could not forget. "Every man I killed looked like me," he said, his voice breaking. "They called me half-born, cursed, unworthy. But I saw in their eyes the same fear I carried in mine." Sigruna listened in silence, her heart aching. "Then you understand now," she said finally. "You understand why I never sought revenge." He looked at her, the weight of comprehension settling over him like a mantle. "You were stronger than I ever knew." She shook her head. "No, my son, I was only tired of watching the world burn." In the months that followed, Sigruna's health began to fade. The winters grew colder, the nights longer. Arik visited her every evening, reading to her from the old sagas she once told him as a boy. But one night, as he finished the tale of Bjorn Ironside, she stopped him with a weak smile. "Do you know what they never wrote, Arik? They never wrote what became of the women, the ones who held kingdoms in their arms while men turned them to dust. They never wrote of the mothers who buried their sons or the queens who outlived their crowns." He bowed his head. "Then I will write it," he said softly. "I will make sure they remember." She reached up, touching his cheek. "Then promise me this. When I am gone, rule not with the sword, but with the story." When the dawn came, the queen who had survived conquest, exile, and history's silence was gone. Sigruna of Ironfell, the captive who became legend, passed peacefully in her sleep, her hands folded as if still praying for the world she had tried to mend. The people wept, the bells of the temples rang, and the city fell into mourning. But none grieved more deeply than her son. For days Arik did not speak. He shut himself away in her chambers, sitting beside her empty chair, tracing the lines of her old cloak as if it still carried her warmth. When he finally emerged, he wore not his crown, but a simple cloak of gray. "The queen is dead," he said to his council, "but her kingdom is not. It lives in every act of mercy we choose." And from that day forward, he ruled not as conqueror nor as king, but as the guardian of her memory. Years later, the poets would sing of Arik the Wise, who turned blades into plows and rebuilt the north and south into one realm. They would say he ended the age of vengeance, that he fulfilled the prophecy of the falcon by teaching men that strength lay not in domination, but in forgiveness. Yet in his heart he carried one truth that no song could ever tell, that his kingdom, his courage, and even his peace were not born from victory, but from the quiet endurance of a woman who had once stood before the end of the world and refused to bow. And when Arik grew old and his time came, he was buried beside her beneath the great tree that overlooked both the mountains and the sea. The people carved into the stone above them the words that would outlast every crown and empire that followed. The legend of the queen and the falcon centuries passed, and time, that quiet sculptor of all things, began to blur the line between memory and myth. The kingdom that Arik had built grew beyond the borders of his dreams. Towns became cities, cities became empires, and his name became the song of history's breath. The people of Ironfell and the clans of Skelderheim no longer spoke of themselves as separate. Their banners bore one crest, the silver falcon soaring over a rising sun. They called themselves the Children of Dawn, for they believed their world had been reborn from the darkness of their ancestors' wars. But though the monuments to King Arik and Queen Sigruna stood tall in marble and gold, few truly remembered the flesh and blood behind the legend. They saw saints where once there had been people, and as the centuries rolled on, the truth of their pain was softened into stories told to children before sleep. Yet in the northern highlands, far from the capital and its polished temples, an old hermit kept the last written record of their true lives. His name was Einar, and he was the last of the ancient order sworn to preserve truth above glory. His hut stood upon a cliff overlooking the frozen sea, the same sea that had once carried Viking ships and sorrow alike. Every evening he would sit beside the fire, parchment spread before him, and write by the flicker of a single candle. He did not write of gods or miracles, but of hearts that broke and healed, of mistakes that became redemption, and of the quiet strength that outlived every sword. His ink bled onto the parchment like tears of memory, as though the spirits of Sigruna and Arik whispered through the wind that rattled his door. The empire was vast now, ruled by kings who claimed descent from Arik's line, though few bore his humility. The latest of them, King Edrin, sat upon a throne gilded with the tribute of 50 nations. He was clever and brave, but his heart was restless. Peace to him was a cage, and glory was the only freedom he knew. He listened to the council's warnings of rebellion in the outer provinces with disdain, calling them cowards afraid of greatness. "Our ancestors conquered the storms," he declared one night in the great hall, "and yet you tremble before whispers." His words echoed through marble pillars carved with scenes of his forefathers, though none seemed to hear their caution. Among those scenes, a single relief depicted Sigruna and Arik standing hand in hand, gazing not at their people, but at the horizon. It was meant to symbolize unity, but to those who looked closely, it carried something more. A silent warning that unity forged through pride would one day shatter. Far from the capital, a young historian named Alara had spent her life chasing that very truth. Born to a family of scholars, she had grown weary of the polished lies taught in schools. The official histories spoke of Sigruna as a saintly queen who had never raised her voice, and of Arik as a flawless king who had ruled without blood. But Alara had read fragments of older texts, burned manuscripts, banned scrolls that hinted at sorrow and struggle. One night, she found a map in a forgotten archive, marking a remote hut by the northern cliffs. The ink was faded, but the name beside it was clear: Einar of the Last Word, driven by a fire. She could not explain. She set out to find him, determined to uncover the story the world had forgotten. Her journey was long and perilous. The empire had grown decadent. Roads that once connected hearts now only served merchants and armies. Yet Alara pressed on, guided by something deeper than curiosity, a quiet faith that truth was the only way to honor those who had come before. When she finally reached the northern sea, a blizzard greeted her, fierce and unyielding. For days she wandered through the white void until, at last, she saw smoke curling from a distant hut. Inside, the hermit Einar sat hunched over a stack of papers, his beard white as snow, his hands trembling with age. He looked up as she entered, his eyes sharp and knowing. "You've come far," he said. "But tell me, do you seek legend or do you seek truth?" Alara knelt before him, her voice steady despite the cold. "I seek the truth that still remembers its pain." Einar studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then you are worthy to hear it." He handed her a scroll bound in faded leather, its edges frayed with time. "This is the last chronicle of the Queen and the Falcon," he said. "It was written by Arik himself before his death. The Empire never saw it because truth, child, is too heavy for kings to carry." Alara unrolled the parchment slowly, her breath catching as she read the first words. "To those who will come after, know this. I was not born to be a king. I was born to remember." The scroll told of his mother's captivity, of Bjorn's redemption, of the wars he had fought not against men, but against the darkness within himself. It spoke of mercy mistaken for weakness, of peace bought with tears. It ended not with triumph, but with humility. "If they call me a hero, let them. But if any heart remembers me truly, let it remember that my mother taught me to endure, not to rule." As she finished reading, tears blurred Alara's vision. "Why did you hide this?" she asked. Einar's voice was soft but firm. "Because the world was not ready. They wanted gods, not people. But perhaps now it is time they remember that even kings bleed and even queens weep." He leaned back, his eyes distant. "Take it, child. Take it and remind them that mercy is the only kingdom that lasts." That night, Einar passed away in his sleep, his final expression one of peace. Alara buried him beneath the northern lights, the auroras painting the sky in colors that seemed to whisper the names of those long gone: Sigruna, Arik, Bjorn, their stories now carried in the wind once more. When Alara returned to the capital, she presented the scroll before King Edrin's court. The hall fell silent as she read aloud the words of Arik's confession. At first, the nobles scoffed, mocking her for daring to speak against their gilded version of history. But as her voice grew stronger, something changed. The courtiers grew still, the guards lowered their spears, and even the king leaned forward, his pride caught between denial and awe. When she finished, no one spoke for a long time. Then Edrin rose, his eyes haunted. "If this is true," he said quietly, "then we have forgotten the very soul of our bloodline." He took the scroll in his hands, studying it as if it might burn him. "Let this story be told again," he declared at last, "not as legend, but as remembrance." And so, for the first time in generations, the Empire spoke not of conquest or kings, but of compassion and truth. The temples carved new inscriptions, not of gods descending from the sky, but of a queen who endured and a king who remembered. Scholars began to teach that mercy was not weakness, but wisdom, that strength without compassion was hollow. The children of Ironfell grew up learning that greatness was not measured by how many kneeled, but by how many were lifted. In time, the statue of Sigruna and Arik was moved from the palace square to the heart of the city where the common people gathered. There, every year on the day of their passing, candles were lit not for rulers, but for the parents of peace. The wind that swept through the square carried whispers. Some said it was only the breeze. Others swore it was the Queen's voice reminding them that empires fade, but love endures, and far to the north, where the sea still sang against the cliffs, travelers claimed that on clear nights, two shapes could be seen upon the horizon, a falcon soaring beside a white flame, rising together toward the dawn.